couple of weeks ago, I was talking to my friend Shelby about classroom management. And I was telling her that, I love talking about classroom management, but when it comes to personally coaching or giving people feedback on classroom management, I feel a little bit uncomfortable. And taking some time to reflect on that, I think the reason why I feel so uncomfortable is that I think true classroom management, like having a classroom that truly operates in a healthy way, comes from having a healthy teacher. And I think oftentimes when people are asking for feedback or for tips and hacks on classroom management, they're looking for a quick solution they can do for their students. But I think that the lasting changes when you really see a big turnaround comes from when you're making changes within yourself. And the reason why I say that is because you can have all of the perfect, amazing systems, but once your body enters that fight or flight mode and a student starts screaming or things start to escalate, your body's in that fight or flight mode and you're going to resort to what your body is telling you to do. Even if you know all the strategies, even if you know all the right things to say, when you're in that moment, it's very easy to resort back to what you know. And the reason why I'm saying this and telling you this is because today's episode, we're going to be talking all about social emotional learning, about its place in the classroom, but also its place for us as educators, because I don't think people talk about frequently enough how important it is for us to have our own healthy well-being as teachers before we can truly help students. So here's the format we're going to follow for today's episode. We're going to start by talking about ways I've helped myself be healthier and be better social emotionally, and how that's helped me see why social emotional learning is such an important aspect in education. And then finally, I'm going to give you some takeaway tips and strategies that you can apply to your own practice to help you better teach your students social emotional skills. So without further ado, let's get into the episode. They don't tell you in teacher school about how student behaviors can bring up something so extreme in you. Like they can trigger all the feels, and nobody really talks about that. So we're going to talk about that today. And I want to tell you a story about a moment I was so incredibly triggered. This is the moment, this is the day when I talk about Instagram and TikTok when I was like, I might not come back tomorrow. I might quit the profession entirely today. This was that day. It was February. The year was 2019 and I was teaching 6th grade. It was just a regular day, but at the end of the day during dismissal, one of my students started to have an outburst. He ended up yelling something, taking out of my classroom, and I was doing something at the back of the room, and I was like, oh crap, I gotta go take care of that. But before I could even get out the doorway, one of the teachers in the hallway came barreling into my room screaming at me about how this student just walked out of my classroom. Didn't I know that? And I was like, yes, I know that. I'm going out there right now. And as I make my way out into the hallway, I see this student and that teacher squaring up in the hallway, not putting hands on anybody or anything like that, but they were screaming at each other, like the teacher and the student. They were just screaming. And after that interaction, I saw my student just take off, like a switch flipped, and he lost it. There was furniture in the hallway, like a desk and a chair. He started taking that, throwing it in the hallway, taking off down the hallway, ripping things off the wall. Like it was a full-blown moment he was having. And I just saw him go barreling down the hallway, destroying things in his path. And I was just in shock. I was literally in shock. And you can't be in shock when you're a teacher though, because there are still 20 kids in my classroom I have to take care of. And so I alert staff. They know that he's going down the hallway. And I go back to my classroom and I see 20 faces looking at me. Like, what do we do next? And I just stood in the classroom during bus time. I was up against my cabinets. I can still picture it today. I was up against my cabinets. I had my back to my class and I stood there during dismissal and took everything within me not to cry. Kids were asking me questions. The kid came up to me and they were like, are you okay? And I could not answer because I was in such a state of panic mode because students yelling, things being thrown, they are such triggers for me internally. And I didn't know that at the time, but now I do. And my body was in full-blown panic attack mode then, but I still had 20 kids I had to take care of. And nobody tells you about those moments in teaching where every ounce of your being wants to take off. Like you want to book it or you want to lose it. Like you have those moments inside of you. And it's so hard to support students or put those emotions on the back burner to help a student or to manage your classroom. Like, it's so hard to do anything when you're in that survival instincts mode. And when this student took off down the hallway, when they started destroying my things, throwing my furniture in the hallway, and they actually came back and they screamed at me too when I was trying to help them calm down, I felt so attacked. And how, looking back on it, I realized that none of that episode was even about me. And typically when it comes to behaviors in the classroom, it's rarely ever about us as the educator. It has everything to do with the student and where they are. And honestly, the more I learn about mental health and the more I learn about your own well-being and how you operate, how you have conversations with people when you're in intense situations, the more I see that a lot of adults tend to make the conversation or make the problem about them. And I'm guilty of this too. But oftentimes I think that when people are upset, it's rarely about us, and it's more so about what is awoken within them. And after this day, when I went home from school, and actually after all of the kids left my room and that door closed, I locked it and I just started sobbing. Like, I distinctly remember sitting on my countertop, holding my face and sobbing and just shaking there. And when I went home that day and I thought, I don't know how I'm going to go back tomorrow, I knew I had to do something different. And I also knew that if I didn't say anything, this student was going to be right back in my classroom the next day, like nothing ever happened. Because it seems like that's what happens way too frequently. Like, there's no resolution. And so going back into school the next day, I knew I had to start doing something differently because my body going back into school was so incredibly anxious. I was in that fight or flight mode, and I know I needed to make some changes. Now, looking back on this day in my second year teaching, as my current 6th-year teacher self, I wish I did things differently that day I went back. I wish I sat all of my students in a circle and I talked to them and I helped them along, but I didn't do that. Instead, I just pretend like nothing happened and went about business as usual. I did talk to my administrators and ask them to please have that student meet with them for counseling or for something before he came back into my classroom, and thankfully they did do that. But I knew I needed to do something because I felt so unwell and so anxious going back into my classroom. So here's what I did. That second year, I started implementing a gratitude journal where every morning I would write 3 things I'm grateful for. I also started going for morning walks. I started praying on my way into school. And eventually it led me to going into therapy. And even more so, this experience mixed with a whole bunch of difficult administrative experiences I had in the 2018-2019 school year and 2019-2020 school year led me to getting my master's in education policy and leadership. And throughout that whole process, I learned a few things. I learned about the conscious parenting approach, especially in 2020 when the pandemic hit and a bunch of us joined TikTok. My eyes were open to this approach when it comes to interacting with children, and my mind was blown. I was like, this makes so much sense. How can I incorporate conscious parenting into my teaching practice? And I also saw that my role in the classroom was not to control, but it was to guide and to support my students. So I decided that I needed to learn how I could show up in a healthy way for my students and for myself. And the avenue that kind of led me down there was a social emotional learning pathway. And it happened through my grad school classes and also through my own personal therapy experience. So before grad school, I knew about social emotional learning. My school actually had us start implementing a program called Choose Love, my second year teaching. And at first, I was so reluctant to do it, you guys. I did not want to take this on. It felt like one more thing on my plate. And I was one of those teachers saying, shouldn't kids be learning this at home? And looking back on that now, I feel like hindsight's 2020. I mean, should students be learning social emotional skills at home? Yes. But are they? It depends on the home. And so now I see that there is such an important space for social emotional learning in school. And is it one more thing on teachers' plates? Yes, it is. But is it maybe one of the most important things on our plates as teachers? I also think it is. So with that in mind, going into that second year teaching, when we started implementing social emotional learning, I started to see the change it was having in our students. And through some of the discourse and the activities that we were doing as a part of the Choose Love program, I saw what an emotionally volatile state many of my students were in. And truthfully, it's only been amplified ever since then. I don't know if it's the pandemic. I don't know if it's I've become more competent in helping students kind of navigate this sphere, but every single year since, I have seen such a tremendous amount of students just even like craving a space where they can get resources or where they can get tools to help them navigate their own emotions. And it's heartbreaking. Like some of the things that you see as a teacher, I know I'm going on a tangent right now, but some of the things that you see as a teacher in the classroom, like they don't prepare you for. Like they don't prepare you for when students tell you they think about taking their lives. Or when students tell you about the abuse they've experienced, like the cries I've heard of kids just opening up about something terrible they've experienced and like finally telling someone, like I still hear that. I still hear those cries. And they don't tell you about that when you're in teacher school. But there is such a need for social emotional support, and we don't have enough counselors. We don't have enough psychologists in the school, and parents are working so many jobs. There's so many pressures, and they honestly probably don't even have some of the skills needed to have these conversations, just like us teachers don't. You know, we all have to learn it together, and we have to show up for our students. And so all of that to say that teaching students about social emotional learning is so important. And I started to see that as my second year of teaching progressed, and I saw the impact that this program had on my students. And it also was further solidified by doing my own homework and doing my own learning, where I saw just how necessary interventions in the social emotional sphere is, especially when it comes to behaviors in the school to prison pipeline, just how important our role as teachers is. So now that we know this, and now that we know social emotional learning is so important for our students, how can we actually incorporate it in a way that we can do, right? Because it's one thing to say, oh, have all these conversations, do all these things. But if our natural reaction is to do X or to do Y, like how do you actually get there? And I really think it starts from within. So I want to go over a few strategies I've learned through my grad school classes that help me kind of develop that own social emotional learning within myself, with the goal that you'll be able to implement this with your students. Now, I wrote these things down, and some of these things I learned, well, actually most of these things I learned was through my grad school course. For those of you who don't know, I got my master's degree in education policy and leadership, and so there were quite a few like human resource classes I took where I learned about how you have difficult conversations with people or how you navigate through a very emotionally charged space. So let's go over some of those things I learned right now, and honestly, most of these strategies are coming from the book Crucial Conversations. I will link the book in the description notes of this video in case you want to check it out, but it was an amazing book, a very easy nonfiction read, and I learned so much through it. So let's go over a few things I learned that I've incorporated in my social emotional learning approach that has revolutionized my classroom. So the first thing that I learned was about decentering myself in conversation. And another story, that same second year teaching, I have this distinct memory of feeling so taken advantage of by my students and how they were treating our room and treating me as their teacher, that one night after school, I took like 25 minutes, and I cringed thinking about this, but I took like 25 minutes and I wrote down every single thing I do as a teacher on the whiteboard. And then the next morning when the kids came in, some of them saw the whiteboard and they were like, oh my gosh, these are all things that you do for us. And then I remember one student, like the one student who gave me the hardest time that year, he looked at the board and he was like, okay, whatever. And he started laughing at it. And that made me feel so triggered inside. Like, how can you laugh at all these things I'm doing for you? But none of it was about me. None of any of that stuff. Honestly, when it comes to behaviors, very rarely are they actually about you. It might be the student feeling attacked based on something that we've said or done as educators, but it rarely has anything to do about who we are as a person when you're interacting in that teacher base. So I started really decentering myself in conversation, especially when there were behavior issues. Instead of thinking like, why was the student being disrespectful to me? I would think something like, why might the student, or how might the student not be feeling respected if this was their response? I'm kind of trying to take myself out of it. And that lended itself to having more fruitful conversations about social emotional skills with my students, because I started actually modeling what I was talking about, you know? The next thing I started doing was contrasting. And what contrasting was defined as in my grad school classes was something like this. If a student's upset with you, you would say something like, I'm not saying X, I am saying why. And somehow saying a phrase like that was able to de-escalate a situation, especially if a student already came in with a narrative about how things are going to go. When you contrast and you say something like that, it kind of flips a switch in their brain and they're like, oh, okay, so this isn't exactly happening the way I thought. It's going to happen this way instead. So contrasting was really helpful in navigating that social emotional sphere with my students. The next thing I started doing was pausing to regulate my own emotions. And this pause can sometimes be a couple of seconds, or honestly, sometimes I shut down the entire class for 2 minutes. I turn the lights off and I tell the kids, I need like 2 minutes, guys, and then we can regroup. I have to regulate myself right now. And I sit in front of the classroom and I model breathing. But taking those couple of minutes sometimes, or even seconds as well, it could be seconds, but taking that time to regulate myself has been so important. And it's been one of the greatest things I've done actually in my management practice, because it helps me maintain my cool and my composure as the adult in the room and actually have a more productive conversation, as opposed to me just responding to something or reacting to something in a more triggered state. So speaking of triggers, I've also started identifying my own triggers in the classroom. Like now I know that if a student walks out of my room, I feel so triggered. I know that if students raise their voice at me, I feel triggered. I know that if students are laughing at each other, I feel triggered. And there are some behaviors where I don't feel very triggered, but I know for a fact that those three will give me a more emotional reaction than other things. And so I have to kind of go into those situations knowing that, and knowing that my body is going to be reacting in a fight or flight way when it doesn't necessarily need to. And doing that has helped me create a healthier space for my students, because I'm not the adult who's just lashing out and reacting because of my own life experiences. I can instead kind of compartmentalize and meet the student where they are and help them through their situation and not take it so personally. All right, the next thing I want to share with you is a direct quote from my readings in grad school about having these crucial conversations. It's from that book that I was telling you about before, but it goes like this. When conversations become crucial, you'll restore to the forms of communication you've grown up with debate, silent treatment, manipulation, and so on. The reason why I'm sharing that quote with you is because you just naturally, as a human being, are going to resort to your almost instinctual behaviors that you've grown up with. So when you're not consciously operating in a way where you are identifying your own triggers and you're realizing how you're behaving in a situation, it makes it really easy to kind of go off the deep end and lose sight of the actual goal. And I mean, all of these things can also happen in classroom management too. We're only people. And when people are in these intense conversations, like I was telling you about earlier, when that student was yelling at me and throwing furniture in the hallway. Like when you're in that situation, it's only natural to resort to those instincts that you grew up with, but it doesn't make it healthy. It doesn't make it the right thing to do. And being mindful of that can really help you be a better model of social emotional learning for your students and incorporate a stronger sense of social emotional awareness in your classroom. This book also talked about, as conversations intensify, it's not so much our behavior that degenerates as adults, but it's more so our motives. Instead of trying to resolve a conflict, our motive instead changes to, how can I win? How can I punish? How can I X? How can I Y? It's no longer solution oriented. It's instead trying to prove a point. It's not a healthy motive. So knowing that our motives can degenerate, what can you do with that? I mean, number one, you can be aware of that as a teacher. When you're talking to students and you're having these intense conversations, know that it's only natural sometimes for your motive to degenerate throughout the conversation. Even if you're an adult, even if you're talking to a 12-year-old, like this is a human thing that we do. So you have to be mindful of it. And then once you're mindful of it and you're taking that ownership over yourself, then you can also start teaching your students about it. And you can be accountability partners and help each other navigate that space, because it's not easy. And the fact of the matter is that a lot of us adults are learning these things right alongside kids at this point. So the next thing that you can do is to avoid making what the book called the fool's choice. And the fool's choice is assuming that your answer to your question is an either or answer. Like it's either my way or it's your way. And going into a conversation thinking that's the only resolution possible. The steps they gave you to avoid not making the fool's choice are pretty clear, so I'm going to share share those with you, and then we'll talk about how we can actually do this in the classroom. So the first step to avoid making the fool's choice is clarifying what you actually want from this conversation. Then the next thing you do is clarify what you don't want. Like, what are you not trying to achieve? And then thirdly, present your brain with this more complex understanding of the topic. And as the book said, add and. So you want to achieve blank and you want to do blank. You know, typically the problems that we're facing are not so clear cut as our perception makes it out to be. There's a lot more going on besides just what we assume. So knowing that this is how you can avoid making the fool's choice and making that either or assumption in a conversation, how can you actually incorporate this into your practice? Well, you can start by having tough conversations with your class in this format. So when you're going to sit down and have kind of like a lecture style with your students about their behavior, instead of just talking at them, try using a format like this where you say what you want and what you don't want, and then kind of build your goal together. And by modeling that practice, number one, you're going to be doing it. And number two, you're going to show your students that they can do this as well, and that there are healthy ways to have conversations even when it's intense, even when they're emotionally charged. And it's so important to do this because social emotional learning and classroom management, like it truly starts with us as the adult in the space. And if we're not able to do these things and to model these things in our classroom, how can we really expect our students to? And knowing this, like it's a blessing and it's a curse, right? Because it's good because we know that we have control over ourselves and our emotions, but it's also a little bit scary because we have to take the ownership of that, guys, right? Like in the classroom, we're the adults and we have to own our reactions. We have to own our triggers, own the trauma we've experienced and how that kind of comes back up in our practice with students. We have to own that and we have to work through that before we can really help our students work through it. So I think that's why, just going back to the beginning of the story, why it's a bit difficult giving teachers individual coaching on classroom management, because you can know all the things to say, but you have your own life experiences. And I think until we really sit down and sit with that and navigate that for ourselves, it's pretty hard to do all the things we set out to do in the classroom until we have that moment. And I think it's also pretty hard to teach social emotional learning when you're still going through it yourself too. And so when it comes to social emotional learning, I think the big takeaway is that we as the adult have to be so cognizant and we have to be so present and so self-reflective for ourselves. And then once we start doing that and we start doing our own learning, our own growing, then we can start modeling and incorporating truly healthy and beneficial SEL practices for our students. And this doesn't mean that you're going to wake up one day and suddenly be super strong social emotionally. Like, I think it's always going to be a growing practice, but the more we learn, the more we grow, and the more reflective we are that we are going to make mistakes in this sphere and we're kind of learning alongside our students, I think the more transparent we are with that, the more we can grow and the more we can show students that social emotional learning, it's not like a time suck. It's not a waste of time. It's not one more thing. It's critical and it's a crucial part of teaching and learning and growing. And it has a place in education. It has a place in students' lives. And our lives too. So that was my talk today. That was my spiel about social emotional learning and where it stands in the classroom and how you can strengthen your own approach with it. I'm curious to hear about if your school has social emotional learning periods, if it's encouraged, if it's discouraged, and what your take is on it. And if you have any other skills that have helped you navigate that space and help your students navigate that space. Also, small plug, if you are ever looking for different social emotional learning strategies, I have a whole collection of different activities, and they're more hands-on, more modeling that you can do with your students, and I will link a bunch of them in the description notes of this episode. But thank you guys for being here. Thank you for showing up, and thank you for doing your own work and your own learning when it comes to helping our students. You truly make a difference, and as always, you got this.